The async and await keywords appeared in the JavaScript world after promises. In fact, using async await requires that you understand and be able to work with promises. However, it is a different pattern. Instead of using the .then method to monitor and respond to promises, we use these keywords, async and await. Now, the main purpose of this different pattern, the async await keywords, is to simplify our promise code. So the chaining of promises, multiple then methods, though much cleaner than dealing with the multiple callbacks, could be cleaned up a bit to make it easier to read. That is where async await come in. Async and await make our code look synchronous in nature, even though it is still asynchronous. And because it makes it look synchronous, it's easier to reason about. Now, do you see a pattern here? Promises help simplify all the nesting that happens with multiple callbacks. And async await now are going to simplify promise chaining. Now, how does it simplify it? Well, basically, async functions enable us to write promise-based code as if it were synchronous code, like I said, but without blocking the execution thread. So the code will look like regular synchronous code. By making the code look synchronous, it is much easier to read and reason about. Basically, async await extend promises to make them more usable. The first thing we need to talk about with async await is each of the keywords and what they are used for. So we are dealing with two keywords. The first is async and the second is await. So two separate keywords here. They each have a different purpose. Let's first talk about async. Async is used when defining a function. When async is used as a part of a function definition, it makes the function an async function, which causes the function to return a promise. Now, if the function is already returning a value, that value is wrapped in a promise. If no value is returned, it still causes the function to return a promise. Now, I mentioned that, but the whole purpose of defining a function as an async function is so that we can use the await keyword inside it. But we will get to that in just a minute. Let's first look at defining a function using async. All right, so I'm going to start off by just defining a simple function here. We're going to call it plain function. And basically what I'm going to have this do is log to the console a start message. That's all we want there. And then I'm going to have it return a string, done. That is all we're doing. That is our basic function. Now down here, I set up a variable result and I set it equal to the results of plain function, and we invoke that. We know what we're going to get. It's going to return done. Done is going to be placed into this variable. And I don't think we need to look at that. I think everybody is comfortable with that. We will get the string done in our results variable. All right. Well, let's make a little change here. Let's say we want to define this as an async function. And the way we do that is we place the async keyword right there ahead of the function keyword. All right. Now this is an async function. Now what are we going to get in this results variable? Well, let me save that and let's take a look. We'll actually look this time. There is our start, our console log start, and then if I enter results, well, it's a promise. Like I said, async keywords return a promise. And there we are, we're seeing that promise in results. All right. And well, I should open it up. The result, the value is done because that's what we return from that right here from that function. We return the string done. All right. Now, since this returns a promise, we can handle it like a promise. I can simply invoke plain function like this, and then I can use a then method and pass in a function for the results. We'll store the value in the val variable there, and then I'll just log it to the console so we can see that value. Okay, pretty simple. Kind of stuff we've done in the past, but now we're doing this with an async function, and we can see there's the value that is returned by that async function that returns a promise. Now, as I said, and this is important to reiterate, the main purpose we would define a function as an async function is so we can use the await keyword inside of it. That allows us to use await inside this function, and we would use that await keyword with promises. Now, before talking about that, before showing that, I want to show you some different ways to declare functions as async functions. Right here, I've done a function expression, and that's how, and you can see how we would do it. But what if we did a function definition? Let's do the same thing as a function definition. I would do async as the very first thing. It would look like that. Just going to go ahead and copy this part in here. Okay. So that's how a function definition would look. Now, what if we were doing an arrow function? Well, let me do one of those as well. That would basically be very similar to this, because an arrow function is a function expression. There's our arrow function. Now, how would we define it as an async function? Well, we just put async right there. So similar to what we did in our function expression, except we don't have the function keyword. So we don't need that function keyword with an arrow function. So there are the three different ways we can define async functions with the three different ways we're able to define functions inside of JavaScript. All right, so let me comment these out. I'm going to keep them in here so you can reference them with the sample code files that you get. But we'll comment those out. And now let's deal with await. So what we've shown here so far is not how we would use async. What we've really shown is what async does to the function by itself. And as I mentioned, we set up an async function because we want to use await inside the function. We use await in front of a promise. The purpose of await is to pause execution of the function until the promise returns. So I mentioned async await makes our code more synchronous. Well, if we're pausing execution, then it looks synchronous to us, all right? So await literally suspends the function execution until the promise settles, and then resumes it with the promise results. That doesn't cost any CPU resources because the JavaScript engine can do other jobs in the meantime, execute other scripts, handle events. So we're not blocking code when we pause the function like this. Let's take a look at that. So let me just put right here, I'm just going to copy this in because we've done this before. Here's some promise-based code. We do a fetch, and then we have to respond to it with a .then, and then we take the response object and we run the JSON method on it. We have to respond to that with a promise as well. But it won't block this code here, console.log. That will execute without waiting for this to end. Now, I'm going to comment out this down here as well. And what we want to do now is I want to move this code up here into our async function, all right? And show you how we would use the await keyword with this. These are all promises. This is the fetch statement is returning a promise. And so how are we going to deal with that? Well, first we'll deal with fetch. So I'm going to copy that, put that in here. And how are we going to set that up? Well, we're going to put it in a response variable again. So we're setting that response variable equal to the results of that. But if we put await in front of it, this down here will not execute until this promise is returned. Await pauses the function at this point and will not continue until a promise returns. And so we'll have something in the response variable. Well, what do we want to do with that response variable? Well, we want to convert that response object. That variable contains the response object, and we want to convert it to data that we can work with. And so we're going to set up another variable here, and we're going to set that equal to await. Once again, we're using await because response.json, the JSON method, returns a promise as well. And so we want to await, we want to pause the code until that as returned. Once that's returned, well, we can log it to the console, and this will not execute until all of these are done because the await causes it to pause. We could then have other code that is functioning on this, is working with this, and none of that other code would run until this were complete. All right. In fact, let me go ahead and do something quick. I'll just do another piece of code that we're just working on that JSON variable. We get an array back, and so I want to filter that out. I'm just going to filter out all of the, let's see, what am I returning here? I'm returning to-dos. I'm going to filter out all the to-dos that are completed. Completed, like that. That's either true or false, and so with a predicate function, which is what we pass into the filter, it needs to return it either true or false. That which is true will be placed in the new array, which is right here. And then I'm going to console.log that. So this will show that we can do other things inside of this function, and they will not, they will not run until these promises have been returned. So we're pausing that code. Will it block? Well, right here we have a console log statement, so we'll get to see if that runs without this function blocking it. Whoops, need to have a semicolon there. All right, so let's go ahead and invoke that function like that. We'll save that, take a look. We'll scroll up here. So we got the start message. So we called the function. We immediately got the start from that console log statement. Then we get the when will this display. So it's not blocked. That continues to run. When those promises are finished, our function continues. We log the JSON variable to the console. That's what we have here. And then we run this code, this filter on the array, and get only those that are complete. And that's this last piece of information. And we can see that they are all complete. All right. So that is async and await. Now, I mentioned that the reason we have async and await is it makes promise-based code a little more readable or a little bit easier to reason about. Okay. We don't have that then chaining. Now, some people prefer that, and that's fine if you prefer that. In fact, there are times when I will use that instead of using async and await. But a lot of people prefer async await. They'll use that for handling most of the promises that they're working with. They like the synchronous look of the code, that they can line by line go through it, and any promises, the execution is paused before it goes to anything else. They like that feature. And so that is the async await pattern. Now, let's move on to the next topic, and we'll look at this in a little more detail.